A terrified voice echoed through the cockpit radio. Unknown female inside the cockpit, identify yourself immediately, state your military call sign. For a brief second, nobody answered. The captain's hands trembled as warning alarms screamed around him. Both engines had gone silent nearly 6 miles above the ground, leaving more than 180 lives hanging between the clouds and the mountains below. Flight attendants were comforting crying passengers, while the crew searched desperately for a miracle. Then the quiet woman who had boarded without attracting a single glance reached for the radio. Her voice was calm, cold, confident. Call sign, Ghost Raven. The radio instantly fell silent. Seconds later, fighter pilots escorting the powerless airliner reacted as if they had just seen a legend return from the dead. Ghost Raven? That can't be possible. Inside the cockpit, even the captain stopped breathing. Who was this ordinary passenger? And why were elite military pilots suddenly trusting her with the fate of everyone on board? Before we begin, comment below where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true-style aviation dramas. Just 40 minutes earlier, nothing about Flight 612 looked unusual. Captain Daniel Brooks had completed more than 3 decades in commercial aviation. With thousands of flight hours behind him, he believed there were very few situations he hadn't already faced. Beside him sat First Officer Ryan Carter, a former military aviator known for staying calm under pressure. Together, they had flown this route so many times it almost felt automatic. Outside, the morning sky was flawless. Bright sunlight reflected off the wings as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. Weather reports showed perfect visibility, light winds, and absolutely no signs of turbulence. It was the kind of flight pilots quietly hoped for, routine from departure to arrival. Meanwhile, passengers settled into their seats without a second thought. Among them was a woman traveling alone in row 8 beside the window. She carried only a worn backpack and an old notebook filled with handwritten calculations. She wore simple clothes, avoided conversation, and politely declined help with her luggage. Most passengers never noticed her, but Ryan did. As he completed one final walk through the cabin, something about the woman's posture immediately caught his attention. She wasn't looking at the scenery or checking her phone like everyone else. Instead, her eyes carefully studied every emergency exit, every cabin door, and every safety detail around her, as if she were silently preparing for something nobody else could see. Ryan paused for a moment. Then he continued walking. He had no idea that within the next hour, that quiet stranger would become the only reason everyone aboard might survive. As Flight 612 climbed above the clouds, the atmosphere inside the cabin became peaceful. The seatbelt sign switched off, flight attendants rolled beverage carts through the aisle, children laughed, and travelers relaxed, believing the hardest part of the journey was already over. Up front, the autopilot smoothly guided the aircraft toward its destination, while Captain Brooks and Ryan discussed little more than the weather and where they planned to eat after landing. Only one passenger wasn't relaxing. The woman in row 8 quietly looked out her window, her expression slowly changing. Far ahead, she noticed a thin gray veil stretching across the horizon. To everyone else, it looked like ordinary haze. But years of flying through dangerous airspace had trained her eyes to recognize details others ignored. Something about the cloud didn't feel natural. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a weather chart, a notebook, and a pen. Within seconds, pages filled with numbers, wind directions, altitude estimates, and glide calculations. Every equation led to the same frightening conclusion. The aircraft was flying straight toward danger. The businessman beside her glanced at the strange calculations before shrugging and returning to his laptop. A teenager across the aisle continued watching videos with headphones on. Nobody realized the quiet woman had already begun calculating how long the aircraft could stay in the air if everything suddenly stopped working. She considered calling a flight attendant. But what could she possibly say? There may be something invisible ahead that could destroy both engines. Without proof, nobody would believe her. She slowly closed her eyes, took a controlled breath, and whispered to herself, "Please, let me be wrong this time." Only moments later, the first warning alarm echoed from the cockpit. Without warning, the peaceful silence inside the cockpit shattered. Beep, beep, beep. A bright amber warning illuminated the instrument panel. "Captain, I'm getting an abnormal temperature spike on engine 1. Ryan reported, his calm voice suddenly turning tense. Captain Brooks leaned forward. Probably a faulty sensor. Keep monitoring it. But before either pilot could finish the checklist, the aircraft jolted violently. A deep grinding sound echoed through the left side of the plane. Then came another, and another. The controls began vibrating beneath the captain's hands. "Engine 1 is losing power." The warning horn screamed louder. Before they could react, a second alarm exploded across the cockpit. Ryan's face turned pale. "No, Engine 2 is doing the same thing." For a split second, neither pilot spoke. Then both engines fell silent. The familiar roar that had carried the aircraft through the sky disappeared, replaced by an eerie whistle of wind rushing past the fuselage. The aircraft was no longer flying under power. It was simply falling forward through the sky. Passengers immediately sensed something was terribly wrong. Drinks slid off tray tables. Oxygen masks trembled inside their compartments. Nervous whispers quickly became cries of panic. Captain Brooks grabbed the radio. "Mayday, Mayday! Flight 612 has suffered total engine failure. We have over 180 people on board. Request immediate assistance." Air traffic control responded almost instantly. "Flight 612, confirm both engines have failed?" Ryan desperately attempted an engine restart, flipping switches and running emergency procedures from memory. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. "They're completely dead," he whispered. "We're a glider now." The navigation display painted an even darker picture. Their nearest airport was still dozens of miles away, far beyond the aircraft's remaining glide range. The captain silently stared at the numbers. They weren't going to make it. Then, in the middle of the chaos, Ryan remembered something. The quiet woman in row 8, the notebook, the emergency calculations, the eyes that had studied every exit before takeoff. Ignoring every regulation, he unfastened his harness and rushed out of the cockpit. He was betting the lives of everyone on board on a stranger he had met less than an hour earlier. Ryan raced through the frightened passengers until he stopped beside row 8. The woman hadn't moved. While people around her prayed, cried, and desperately called their families, she remained focused on the notebook resting on her lap. Fresh calculations covered every page: distances, wind direction, descent rates. She looked less like a passenger and more like someone preparing for a mission. Ryan leaned closer. "Ma'am, I need an honest answer. Are you a pilot?" She looked up without the slightest sign of panic. "I was." "Military?" She gave a slow nod. Ryan didn't ask another question. "Come with me." The businessman beside her looked shocked. "Wait, what's happening?" "There isn't time to explain." The woman calmly closed her notebook, picked up her backpack, and followed Ryan toward the cockpit as terrified passengers watched in confusion. The cockpit door opened. Captain Brooks turned around and his expression immediately hardened. "What is this, Ryan? Have you lost your mind? We are in the middle of an emergency." Ryan stood his ground. "Captain, trust me. Just give her 60 seconds. I don't need a passenger telling me how to fly my aircraft." The woman stepped forward, speaking with quiet confidence. "I'm not here to take control. I'm here because your current glide path won't reach the airport." The cockpit fell silent. Captain Brooks frowned. "What did you say?" She stepped beside the navigation display, studying the instruments for only a few seconds. Current altitude, wind speed, ground track, remaining distance. Everything she needed. Then she looked directly at the captain. "If you continue toward the airport, this aircraft will come down several miles short. The numbers don't lie." Ryan quickly checked the flight computer. His heartbeat nearly stopped. The prediction matched her estimate almost exactly. Captain Brooks slowly looked back at the mysterious woman. "Who are you?" She answered without emotion. "My name is Evelyn Hayes. I flew combat missions for nearly 2 decades. The captain folded his arms. "What aircraft?" She met his eyes. "Attack aircraft. Dead stick recoveries. Battle-damaged landings. I've brought powerless airplanes home before." The captain remained unconvinced. "This isn't a fighter jet." "No," she replied calmly. "It's heavier. But gravity doesn't care what you're flying." She pointed toward the navigation screen. "I know a place your computers aren't considering. If you trust me, I can get everyone on this aircraft home alive. For the first time since both engines failed, hope entered the cockpit. But trusting a complete stranger meant risking every single life on board. Captain Brooks stared at Evelyn for only a moment before making the hardest decision of his career. "Fine," he said. "You've got 1 minute. Convince me." Evelyn stepped toward the navigation display, her eyes scanning the instruments with astonishing speed. Altitude, airspeed, wind direction, terrain. She wasn't guessing. She was building a solution. Then she pointed toward a narrow valley surrounded by mountains. "Forget the international airport." Both pilots looked at her in disbelief. "There's an abandoned military runway hidden beyond this ridge. It's old, but it's long enough if we can reach it." Captain Brooks shook his head. "It's farther away than our primary airport." "It is," Evelyn replied. "If you fly like an airliner." The captain frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you stop thinking like a commercial pilot and start thinking like a combat pilot." Before she could explain further, 2 Air Force fighter jets appeared off the aircraft's left wing, ordered to monitor the emergency. A sharp voice crackled through the emergency frequency. "Flight 612, this is Falcon Lead. We understand you've accepted guidance from a retired military pilot. We need immediate identification." Captain Brooks handed Evelyn the radio. She pressed the transmit button. "This is Captain Evelyn Hayes, retired Air Force." There was a brief silence. Then the fighter pilot spoke again. "Captain Hayes, state your call sign." For the first time, a faint smile crossed her face. "Call sign, Ghost Raven." The radio went completely silent. Seconds later, another voice burst onto the frequency. "No way. Ghost Raven is on board?" The fighter pilots could hardly believe what they had heard. Their formation leader keyed the microphone again, but this time his voice carried something completely different. "Respect. Confirm. Are you the Ghost Raven who landed a crippled attack aircraft after losing both engines during combat?" Evelyn answered calmly. "Affirmative." The response from the fighter jets was immediate. "Then every aircraft on this frequency listens to Ghost Raven. She brought pilots home from missions none of us thought were survivable. If she says this airliner can make it, we trust her." Captain Brooks slowly lowered the radio. Only minutes earlier, she had been an anonymous passenger sitting quietly by a window. Now, battle-tested military aviators were placing absolute faith in her judgment. The captain looked into Evelyn's unwavering eyes. His voice was steady. "All right, Ghost Raven. Tell us exactly how to save this airplane." Evelyn tightened the harness on the jump seat and fixed her eyes on the windshield. "Listen carefully," she said. "From this moment on, every movement matters. Every degree you turn, every knot of speed you lose, decides whether these people live or die." The cockpit fell silent. Captain Brooks wrapped both hands around the controls. "I'm ready." Evelyn pointed toward the towering mountain range ahead. "Don't avoid those peaks." Ryan looked at her in disbelief. "You want us to fly closer to the mountains?" "I want you to use them," she explained quickly. "The wind is striking the western slopes. That creates powerful rising air. If we position ourselves perfectly, nature will give us the lift our engines no longer can." It sounded impossible, but they had no better choice. Captain Brooks slowly banked the powerless aircraft toward the ridgeline. Inside the cabin, terrified passengers watched enormous cliffs grow larger through their windows. Some began crying. Others held hands and whispered prayers, convinced the aircraft was flying directly toward the mountains. Ryan couldn't hide the tension in his voice. "Altitude dropping, 21,000 feet. Hold exactly 198 knots, Evelyn instructed. "No faster, no slower." The aircraft drifted closer to the ridge. For several agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then Ryan's eyes widened. "Captain, our descent rate is decreasing." Brooks checked the instruments. "We're still gliding, but we're not falling as fast." Evelyn allowed herself the smallest smile. "We found the lift." The invisible current beneath the wings began carrying the aircraft farther than its performance chart said was possible. Even the fighter pilots circling overhead were stunned. "Falcon Lead to all aircraft. I've never seen an airliner fly like this. It looks like she's teaching the sky itself how to keep them alive." Minute after minute, the aircraft rode the invisible wave. Every mile gained felt like stealing time from death itself. Then Ryan leaned toward the windshield. His voice cracked with hope. "I've got something. 12 o'clock. There." Between the trees, hidden deep inside the valley, a long strip of weathered concrete appeared. The abandoned runway. They had reached it. Now they had only one chance to land. The abandoned runway grew larger with every passing second. There would be no second attempt. No engines, no go-around, no room for error. Captain Brooks tightened his grip on the controls as sweat rolled down his forehead. Every instinct he had built during 30 years of flying told him to add power, but there was no power left to give. Evelyn never looked away from the windshield. "Stay focused," she said calmly. "The runway isn't your target." Brooks glanced at her. "It's the first 1,000 feet. Ryan immediately understood. "If we touch down too far, we won't stop in time." Exactly. Outside, cracked pavement stretched through the forest like a forgotten scar. Tall trees stood at the far end of the runway, waiting silently for even the smallest mistake. "Landing gear." The handle dropped. Thump, thump, thump. The wheels locked into place, and the aircraft instantly lost precious speed. The nose dipped. Passengers screamed as the ground rushed closer. "Flaps 5. Ryan moved the lever. "Flaps 15. The aircraft settled lower. "Hold 160 knots. Captain Brooks made tiny corrections, refusing to over-control the powerless jet. 400 feet. 300. The runway now filled the windshield. Every heartbeat felt louder than the warning alarms. "Easy," Evelyn whispered. "Don't chase the runway. Let it come to you." 100 feet. The fighter pilot circled high above, watching in complete silence. No one spoke over the radio. No one dared interrupt. 50. 40. 30. Evelyn's voice remained unbelievably calm. "Now, gently raise the nose." Captain Brooks eased back on the controls. For one terrifying moment, the aircraft seemed to float. Then, boom! The main landing gear slammed onto the concrete with a violent jolt that shook the entire cabin. "Speed brakes!" Ryan deployed them instantly. "Maximum braking!" Smoke exploded from the tires as the powerless airliner thundered down the abandoned runway. The brakes screamed. The cabin rattled violently. Overhead bins burst open, sending bags crashing into the aisle while passengers held their breath. The trees at the end of the runway rushed closer. 800 feet remaining. 500. 300. The cockpit became deathly quiet. No one spoke. No one blinked. Then, the aircraft lurched one final time and stopped, less than 200 feet from the trees. For several seconds, there was absolute silence. Then the cabin erupted into uncontrollable tears, cheers, prayers, and applause. Against every prediction, they had survived. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Captain Brooks still gripped the control column so tightly that his fingers had turned white. Ryan sat frozen beside him, staring through the windshield as if he couldn't believe the runway was real. Then the cockpit door burst open. A flight attendant stood there with tears streaming down her face. "Captain, are we safe?" Brooks slowly nodded. "We made it." The words spread through the cabin like wildfire. Passengers who had been preparing for the end of their lives were now hugging complete strangers. Some dropped to their knees in prayer. Parents held their children so tightly they refused to let go. Even the crew, trained to remain composed during emergencies, couldn't hold back their emotions. Outside, rescue helicopters thundered toward the abandoned airstrip, while the escorting fighter jets made one final pass overhead before dipping their wings in salute. But as emergency teams examined the aircraft, the celebration quickly turned into a mystery. The investigators removed panels from both engines. Within minutes, their expressions changed. The turbine blades were coated with a strange, glass-like substance that had fused to the metal under extreme heat. One investigator shook his head. These engines never stood a chance. They were destroyed the moment they flew through whatever contaminated the air. Air samples were rushed to a laboratory. Hours later, the results shocked everyone. The particles weren't naturally concentrated. Someone had deliberately released them into a busy flight corridor, using specialized equipment designed to keep them suspended at cruising altitude. This wasn't a freak accident. It was a carefully planned attack. Within 24 hours, federal agents tracked the operation to a secret extremist group hiding outside the city. Search warrants uncovered modified drones, chemical dispersal systems, detailed airline routes, and handwritten plans targeting commercial flights. 7 suspects were arrested before they could strike again. News of the miracle spread across the world. Every headline asked the same question. Who was the quiet woman in row 8? And how did she save an entire airplane when every expert believed the flight was already lost? The answer would leave millions of people speechless. 3 days later, every major news channel carried the same headline. Mystery passenger saves airliner after total engine failure. Reporters from around the world packed a crowded press conference, eager to meet the woman everyone now called a hero. Evelyn Hayes walked to the podium wearing the same simple jacket she had worn on the flight. No medals, no military uniform, no dramatic entrance, just quiet confidence. A reporter asked the question everyone wanted answered. If you were one of the Air Force's most respected pilots, why did nobody know who you were? The room fell silent. Evelyn took a slow breath. Because years ago, she began softly, I refused to follow an order that would have taken innocent lives. She explained how that single decision ended the career she loved. She had been forced to leave the military, struggled to find work, and spent years believing her experience no longer mattered. For a long time, she admitted, I thought everything I had learned had been wasted. She paused, remembering the terrified faces aboard Flight 612. But life has a strange way of reminding you why your journey happened. Every lesson I learned, every sacrifice I made, every painful day I questioned myself, prepared me for one moment. The moment 182 strangers needed someone who wouldn't panic. Captain Brooks stood and faced the cameras. I've flown airplanes for over 30 years, he said. That day taught me the greatest lesson of my career. A real leader isn't always the loudest person in the room. Sometimes they're sitting quietly by a window, waiting for the moment when others need them most. The room erupted into applause. Months later, aviation authorities introduced new emergency training inspired by the techniques used that day, ensuring future pilots would be better prepared for situations once thought impossible. As for Evelyn, she never called herself a hero. Whenever someone thanked her, she smiled and gave the same answer. I simply did what anyone should do when they have the ability to help. Because true courage isn't about seeking recognition. It isn't about fame, medals, or applause. It's about stepping forward when everyone else steps back. And sometimes, the person who changes the course of history isn't sitting in first class. They're the quiet stranger in row 8, the one nobody notices, until the world suddenly needs them.